Caught by the Cowboy Dad. By Melinda Curtis. Prologue. Devin Monroe's summer was ruined. All his friends from high school were heading off to college for the summer session that started in a week to get a jump on their class ranking. And what was Devin doing? A 10-day guys-only RV trip with his dad. Worst summer ever. And Dad. Geez, 2 years from turning 40 and the man's life was falling apart. Not that all of it was Dad's fault. In January, Great-Grandpa Harlan had disinherited Dad on the same day that Grandpa Darrell had fired him. Was it any wonder Dad was going gray? And then 2 days ago, in front of half the Monroe family, some doctor had walked up to Dad and announced she was having his baby. Devin cringed remembering the spectacle. Was it any wonder his dad had gone to the hospital the next day with all the symptoms of a heart attack? Turns out it was only stress and dehydration. Still, this just wasn't Dad's year. But Devin still wanted it to be his year. And getting a jump on his college ranking by attending the second summer session was the way to do it. If Devin could get Dad to cancel the RV trip and spend some time with Dr. Baby Mama. Devin stomped into their hotel room in Second Chance, Idaho. Dad's phone sat on the nightstand in the lodgepole inn. Dad was nowhere in sight. It would be wrong to search his contacts for Dr. Bernadette Carlisle. It would be wrong to send her a text message using his dad's phone and to apologize for the unhelpful way Dad had reacted to the baby news, as if Devin was Dad. And it would really be wrong to invite Dr. Carlisle along on the RV trip to Yellowstone. Devin did it anyway.
Chapter 1. I'm going to be a father again. It was the first time Holden Monroe had said the words out loud. Speaking them made it feel as if an elephant had taken a seat on his chest. Yes, his ex-girlfriend was pregnant. Yes, he'd love this child as much as the first. But that wasn't the main reason for the elephant's sit-in. Holden was recently unemployed, might be going broke and had suffered a health scare. He lay on a mattress with springs that sagged and studied the cracks in the ceiling of the lodgepole inn. His life had come apart, start to finish, in a little town he'd never heard of a year ago called Second Chance, Idaho. You don't have to sound like it's the end of the world, Dad. Devin sat on the other bed in the hotel room perusing a pre-med textbook. He was 17, very smart and had graduated from high school a year early. The family wedding they'd come to attend in Second Chance hadn't happened because Laurel, the bride, went into labor on the day and had given birth to twin girls. The ceremony had been rescheduled to next weekend. There was nothing keeping them here. Adventure awaited in the form of a father-son RV trip. But Holden couldn't seem to move from the bed. A second child. He should be coming to terms with the idea and rejoicing. Instead, he couldn't seem to focus. The first drops from a summer rainstorm pinged on the window. The log walls creaked from the incoming storm's gathering wind. A fitting soundtrack to the ruination of his life. What was next? A full eclipse and Armageddon. I'm going to be a father again. Dad? Dad, did you hear me? I said it's not the end of the world. Yes, but I'm doing the math. What math? Devin turned a page. I'm 38. You're 17. And when Bernadette's baby is 17, I'll be 55. An age when he should have been counting down to retirement with all his investments in order after running the Monroe Holding Corporation for at least a decade. But he'd never advanced to the CEO position in his family's company. In fact, the Monroe Holding Corporation no longer employed Holden, period. He barely had enough in savings to pay for Devin's medical degree, much less finance his own company. Because that's what fired, middle-aged men from Manhattan usually did. They branched out on their own. But to do what? He had no answer. And why would he? He hadn't envisioned starting over this. Late in life. Holden's shoulders crept up toward his ears. For a man who'd grown up with a silver spoon and lived the last 10 years on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, this was the end of the world. So what if you're the father of two who'll be ancient in 17 years? Devin flipped a page. The text was so small Holden couldn't even begin to read the headings. Could be worse. Dr. Carlisle could be having twins, they said in unison. Twins ran deep in the Monroe DNA. Maybe I could use a double blessing, Holden said thickly, trying to find a silver lining. When you hit rock bottom, that's when your true character rises. That was his grandpa Harlan Monroe talking. He'd always been good with the pep talks, like one of those spin class instructors who spent half the time talking about being the best you can be, instead of yelling at you to pedal as if your life depended on it. The rest of my life hinges upon how fast I pedal now. He'd always been able to envision his ideal future and chart a course to get there. That course involved being a team player in the Monroe family, devoting long hours to brokering deals and wisely investing for the company and individual Monroes. But all the while, he hadn't done the same for himself. He'd lived the New York City high life, gambling his future on becoming the family CEO. And he'd lost. Dad, did you hear me? Devin closed that thick book of his. Are you ready to leave? Or can we officially cancel this father-son road trip? Cancel. Holden sat up, swinging his long legs over the edge of the bed. He might not know what the rest of the year held, but he knew what he was doing for the next week. We're not canceling. Grab your bags. They were already packed and had just been waiting for Holden to say the word. Let's go. You're headed to MIT in the fall. I know how college students are. You'll forget your old man a week in. Dad. Legally, you have me 2 weeks between now and the end of the year. Devin turned 18 in January. He'd inherited Holden's wry humor, along with his black curly hair and gray eyes. Let's reschedule. We could do a road trip between terms. Meanwhile, you could, get some rest, like the doctor ordered. His doctor. His ex. None of that talk. We're going to make Yellowstone by dinner time. They had a 10-day schedule to keep, after all. And besides, Holden didn't want to discuss his health. I received the all-clear from Bernadette. After what had felt like a heart attack 2 days ago. She said it was nothing. And hadn't that been embarrassing? For a few hours, he'd felt like he was dying, but, medically, there was nothing wrong with him. To add to his mortification, it had been his ex, Bernadette, the woman pregnant with his child, who delivered the ego-crushing diagnosis. And she'd looked good while doing it, while he. I'm fine. You have to deal with your anxiety, Dev said, stuffing his pre-med book in his backpack. I do not have anxiety. I can handle stress. Holden got to his feet, drew a deep breath and forced his shoulders away from his ears. All evidence to the contrary, Devin murmured with attitude. Holden had forgotten what it was like to be a teenager, so full of snark that sometimes you couldn't censor your inner voice. I can hear perfectly well. Before Devin could answer, someone knocked on their hotel room door. It was Holden's cousin Shane, looking healthy and relaxed. Thought I'd swing by while I was in town and see you off. So chipper. So cheerful. He'd probably never stressed his way to a false alarm heart attack. A second elephant joined the first on Holden's chest, creating a cramped, burning sensation around his heart, the infamous anxiety Bernadette had warned him about, the same condition that had sent a very real feeling electrical jolt down his left arm a few days ago. Deep breath in. Think happy thoughts. Avoid dwelling on the impulse to slug your cousin. A primitive growl worked past his flailing happy thoughts. For years, Holden and Shane had been jockeying for the position of heir to the Monroe conglomerate of companies. There could be only one CEO of the Monroe Holding Corporation. And then Grandpa Harlan had died and left their fathers everything, but only on the condition that they disown Harlan's grandchildren, a move apparently designed to inspire the 12 of them to strike out on their own. There would be no CEO position for either Shane or Holden. All the third-generation Monroes had been fired as a result. Instead of wealth, they'd been given a small town in the Idaho mountains. Second chance was worthless in Holden's eyes, except for a cache of stagecoach gold Shane had found and the value of the land for developers of luxury homes and ranchettes. Shane, bleeding heart that he was, saw a second chance's future more optimistically than Holden. Dad? Did you hear me? Devin sounded both worried and exasperated. He turned to Shane. His responses have been on delay all morning. Yes. I'm a little foggy. Holden rose to his own defense. Let's blame it on my doctor recommending I lay off caffeine. Brain fog is worrisome. Shane studied Holden's face as if he were studying the daily stock market report. He gave his head a little shake as he ran a hand through his short, dark hair. Dev, why don't you take your suitcases down to the motorhome? On it. Devin was entirely too eager to escape the room. After his son left, Holden crossed his arms, leaned his back against the far log wall and scowled at Shane. I'm fine. Other than the anxiety-bearing elephants hindering his breathing. Why doesn't anyone believe me? Why? Shane shoved his hands into his pants pockets. Maybe because your expression today is as buttoned up as your personality sometimes is. A primal sound escaped Holden's throat. Shane could be so annoying. If you equate being buttoned up with having everything under control, then I agree with you. Holden was the Iceman. Everyone on Wall Street said so. Everything under control. Shane crossed his arms over his chest. That's great. So, tell me, oh mighty negotiator and financier. What are you going to do about Bernadette and the baby? What are your career plans? Shane prompted in an easygoing voice. You've got it all under control. Spill. And while we're on the topic of control, Shane continued, if you could sell Second Chance, where would you start? It wasn't Holden's expression that was the problem. It was his brain. Thoughts flew about his head in bits and snatches. Holden was certain he knew what he wanted to do about the baby, his career and the future of Second Chance. He was certain, and yet, he couldn't sort through the jumble of thoughts in his head to take a stand on any of those topics. Shane sat down on the corner of Holden's bed. If you were fine, you'd have shot back at me. He sighed. You can talk to me. I understand stress. You understand nothing, Holden grumbled. Not the pressure on his chest. Not the jumble of thoughts in his head. Not the embarrassment of going to the emergency room for no concrete medical reason. Nothing. Really? Shane quirked a dark brow. I'm here for you. Enlighten me. Whatever sent me to the hospital, which, according to the tests, wasn't a heart attack, blood clots, malfunctioning thyroid, diabetes or cancerous tumors, I refused the diagnosis. Shane frowned. Stress. Anxiety. Holden hated the familiar way the word rolled off his tongue. That's what they call it now, Shane. Anxiety. Do you know what they used to call what happened to me? Frowning, Shane shook his head. A breakdown. Holden felt frustration build in his veins. Strong, powerful, capable men weren't felled by life's pressures. I am not broken. He was many things, proud, a cool negotiator, a workaholic. But he wasn't broken. Shane nodded, as if he sympathized. Holden, you're not broken. Holden wanted to throttle Shane. But you're not fine, either. Something's bothering you. Something more than Bernadette's baby news. You showed up in town wound tighter than an 8-day clock. Maybe you should spend a week or two at the family ranch in Texas. Sleep late and ride horses. Either way, I'm here for you if you want to talk. Holden didn't want to share his feelings with anyone, most especially Shane. But he didn't want to carry elephants around on his chest, it's going to take more than deep breaths to get rid of them. Before Holden could decide how much more he should say, Shane continued his kumbaya speech. Since I've been in Second Chance, my priorities have changed. Family, not the bottom line, is the most important thing to me. I know we've been at odds about whether to keep or sell this town. Now that a majority of the family want to retain ownership of Second Chance, we need someone with your financial expertise to guide us long-term. If Shane knew the straits of Holden's personal finances, he wouldn't ask for his help. Get some rest. Think about it. And if you need anything, ask. I'm here. Shane took in what must have been a broken look on Holden's face. Honestly, asking for help doesn't make you any less of a man. Shane left before Holden could form a scathing retort. Ice men don't ask for help. It was a great response. Too bad he made the statement to an empty room. His phone pinged with a message. It was from Bernadette. She'd sent 2 words. 2 words Holden didn't understand. I accept.
This is a mistake, Dr. Carlisle, Bernadette muttered to herself, pulling up her hood against the scattering raindrops. She carried a small suitcase and backpack down the trail from Second Chance's live-in medical clinic to the massive RV parked in front of the lodgepole inn. Custody agreements aren't made on camping trips. But custody agreements weren't made without communication either. She and Holden had created a baby together, and they hadn't talked about it face-to-face yet. He'd apologized for taking the news poorly via text. He'd asked about her health in a text. She was going on a road trip with him based on a text. Texts. Really? Were they in high school? They hadn't texted this much when they'd been dating, which was saying a lot since they'd dated long distance for several months. Mistake. Mistake. Mistake, she muttered, all the while continuing to move toward the motor home and sucking on a peppermint to counter her morning sickness. It wasn't just a custody agreement she wanted with Holden. She wanted answers from him. Why had he dumped her? And what kind of father was he going to be to her baby? Mine, not ours. It was clear that Holden wasn't going to be a helicopter parent, which left her to wonder, did he want to be involved with this baby at all? Dark clouds threatened more than the current sprinkle, reminding her she had other worries, including the listing of her beloved OB/GYN practice in Ketchum, for which she'd had no offers. She'd signed on to be Second Chance's doctor, but it wouldn't be official until the end of the month. She'd taken time off this week because she'd known Holden was coming to Idaho. Standing at the motorhome's bumper, Devin waved to Bernadette. He was Holden's son. Not that Holden had told her he had a child when they'd embarked upon their long-distance, now-defunct romance. And from what Bernadette had gleaned from Holden's relatives in town, Devin was a science prodigy. A nerd, they'd lovingly said, although he looked like a boy who could do anything he set his mind to. Although how he was dressed didn't quite suit the moment. They were going camping, and he was wearing what looked like a boarding school uniform, a blue polo shirt, khaki slacks, and sneakers. Devin! 12-year-old Gabby burst onto the porch of the inn that her family ran, blushing to the roots of her strawberry blonde hair. She pushed out a breathless bite before darting back inside. Devin looked pained. He gave a half-hearted wave that Gabby probably missed. That boy acted as if he had yet to discover girls. What kind of father has Holden been to Devin? Bernadette asked herself, crunching her peppermint. That would be a good predictor of what kind of father he'd be to her little one. Hey, document. Roy, the old man who lived in the cabin nearest the medical clinic, greeted her from his porch. He wore a t-shirt, a pair of blue coveralls, a short raincoat and a smile that was just as comfortable as his worn handyman uniform. You talkin' to yourself? Nope. I'm talking to you, Roy, Bernadette said hurriedly. Doctors weren't supposed to be eccentric, even small-town ones. I see you're packed. He fell into step behind her on the trail through the pines. Heading out with Holden and his boy? Yes, Bernadette chirped with the utmost patience. Out of habit, she gave the old man a quick glance. In med school, she'd been trained to assess the health of those around her. Roy's color was healthy, and his steps steady. Good. They reached the bottom of the trail and crossed the road toward the inn. Guess you two have a lot to work through. Roy continued to tag along. I guess we do. Bernadette was normally straightforward with friends and family. But she hated that everyone in Second Chance knew the ramshackle state of her personal life, that she was having Holden's baby and that Holden had ghosted her for the past month. And now, thanks to Roy, they'd know that Holden had invited her to go along on this road trip. She hoped they didn't expect them to return married. Bernadette certainly didn't. Dr. Carlisle. Odette rounded the front of the motorhome. She was an elderly, petite woman with short gray hair and a tendency toward hypochondria. Today, she looked confident, hearty and hale. She raised a canvas bag of pale green yarn and knitting needles toward Bernadette even though she was still 20 feet away. "You left your knitting bag at my house last night." "On purpose." Bernadette thanked the old woman anyway. "I didn't want you to drive off without it." Odette pressed the bag into Bernadette's arms when she reached her. "You need to practice your stitches if you want to make that baby of yours a knit cap." Prior to her pregnancy, the only stitches Bernadette aspired to do neatly and evenly were the ones with black thread that helped flesh knit together. "Hey, Dr. Carlisle." Standing near the motorhome's door, Devon's gaze didn't quite reach Bernadette's approaching toes. "Let's get you settled." "Great." If only her stomach would settle. Roy ran a hand over the tan siding of the RV. "Sure would like to see inside that fancy rig." "No time for tours, sir," Devon said politely. "We're about to leave. Just waiting on Dad to get a coffee or something. He shouldn't be chugging caffeine." As soon as the words left her mouth, Bernadette grimaced. That was Dr. Carlisle talking. If she was going to work through custody details with Holden, she needed to be Bernadette, his ex-girlfriend, not his doctor. Sorry? I'm sure he's getting water, not coffee." The teen grabbed her bags quicker than a bellboy intent upon a good tip and bounded up the stairs into the vehicle, leaving Bernadette no choice but to follow. "Don't forget to practice your stitches." Odette turned. "Come on, Roy. We're allowed coffee." The pair headed toward the Bent Nickel Diner. Bernadette bid her send-off party farewell and climbed the stairs into a motorhome that was more luxurious than her apartment in Ketchum. The cabinetry was a glossy black and the appliances gleaming stainless steel. The refrigerator was full-size and conveniently located near a kitchen island. There was a narrow dining table in front of a gray couch that looked like it would pull out into a bed. The front two seats were charcoal leather, matching the finish on two recliners swiveled toward a large television. This was a wealthy man's mobile domain. Holden always wanted the best of everything. "We have nothing in common." "Did we ever?" Her stomach somersaulted. She popped another peppermint. "Back here." Devon beckoned from a bedroom in the rear. That room was plush, too. A soft gray comforter draped over a king-size bed. A crystal chandelier sparkled above it. There was another television mounted on the wall near built-in storage cabinets. It was cozy and roomy, all at the same time. It made her want to take this bedroom and add it onto the medical clinic because there was no way she was going to climb a ladder to the clinic's loft to sleep when she was 9 months pregnant in December. Or with a newborn. Or when she was Odette's age. "Maybe Holden will loan me the motorhome to live in while I'm pregnant." She scoffed, ignoring Devon's questioning look. "And maybe Holden is planning to drop down on one knee and propose." She stopped herself from an eye roll. The man had never told her he wanted to stop seeing her. He just disappeared from her life. An easy enough act when she lived in Idaho and he lived in New York. Was that behavior motivated by his decline in health? Anxiety could close in on a person and close them off to others. Don't make excuses for him. You have your own bathroom. Devon opened a door. "In case you get sick. Do you want to use it?" The way Devon looked at Bernadette. It was almost as if he wanted her to rush into the bathroom and upchuck. Which was a very real possibility since nerves jangled through her system and upset her steadily increasing, nausea-inducing, rampant hormones. The teen blushed and gave Bernadette a weak smile. "Do you want to see the bathroom? It's pretty." He stood back so she could enter. "Sure. Best check out the facilities in case she needed them." Bernadette inched into the room. Footsteps pounded on the motorhome stairs. Holden. Her entire body went all hot and sweaty, stuffing her ears and throat with cotton, churning the piece of dry toast she'd eaten for breakfast, sending her gaze to the commode. "I'll give you some privacy." Devin closed the bathroom door. A moment later, it sounded as if the bedroom door was closed. Muffled voices drifted to her. Bernadette drew several deep breaths while she stared at her image in the mirror. Her shoulder-length blonde hair was in need of highlights. There were circles under her blue eyes. And her glasses. Well, she was rather fond of the geeky black frames, but they weren't exactly a fashion statement. Nor were her jeans and gray-green t-shirt. How in the world did I attract the attention of anyone, including Holden Monroe? The motor home started up. Backed up. Pulled out onto the road. The shift in equilibrium brought on the nausea once more. Bernadette splashed water on her face. The last thing she wanted was to start talking to Holden and get carsick. The trip to Yellowstone would take about 6 hours. There was plenty of time to let her stomach settle before they spoke. She left the bathroom and lay down on the bed, closing her eyes. She'd barely slept last night, tossing and turning as she debated whether or not to come on this trip. And now she was bone-weary. She could put off facing Holden for a few more minutes.
Chapter 2. "This great," Holden said to Devin after almost 2 hours of driving through the Idaho mountains. "Just two guys with nothing but open road ahead." Devin mumbled something that sounded like agreement. There'd been a downpour after they left Second Chance, but the day was now clear and bright. And with every mile logged, Holden felt the weight on his chest lighten. He was breathing easier. His shoulders didn't feel as if they were up around his ears. This road trip was just what he needed. Nobody was asking him about his long-term plans, and he wasn't worried about short-term problems. There was just the road ahead and a day he could fill any way he and his son wanted, as long as they reached Yellowstone in time to attend a stargazing session. Devin had a textbook open in his lap. The kid was going to get carsick if he kept reading on these winding roads. Not to mention he was missing the scenery, which was pretty spectacular. The Sawtooth Mountains were to the east, lined by meadows dotted with wildflowers, perfect for long horseback rides. The slim ribbon of highway wound through tall pines next to the Salmon River. There were no traffic jams. No stoplights. No high-rises. No pressure. "There's an old silver mine up ahead." Holden pointed to a hand-painted sign, the second one they'd passed. "They give tours. Why don't we stop?" It's what his grandfather would do. Harlan had frequently taken 12 grandchildren on the road in his motor home, stopping at places of interest that weren't as memorable as the time spent touring them, shared by the Monroe Grands. "Whatever you want." Devin had been fidgeting in the passenger seat the entire ride, glancing over his shoulder as if he wanted to move to a seat in the back and study that textbook in peace. "I don't want to take a break if you don't want to get out. This is supposed to be a father-son bonding trip." Devin glanced over his shoulder one more time. "We can pull off. I'm up for it." Holden smiled. "Great. One stop and then you can study and back if you want." "Really?" Devin's gray gaze landed on Holden. "You mean it? Your feelings won't be hurt." "My feelings won't be hurt." Already, Holden was looking forward to pulling over. It'd be just like his childhood trips with Grandpa Harlan. He and Devin would joke and laugh and soak in some history. Grab an ice cream or a burger at a local shop. They'd make memories, ones Devin could look back on fondly one day. "Look. Here's the turn." Holden slowed the vehicle just as the bedroom door swung open. He glanced back. Bernadette stood in the bedroom doorway, hair attractively mussed and glasses askew. Reflexively, Holden spun back around and jammed on the brakes harder than he should have. The RV skidded on the narrow highway and came to a slanting stop in a ditch half filled with rainwater. "Is everyone okay?" Holden held out a hand first toward Devon, who nodded once, and then toward Bernadette, whose head bobbed. Several things registered in Holden's brain simultaneously. The motor home didn't take turns like his sports car. Bernadette's purple suitcase lay on the bed behind her. And Devon didn't seem surprised to see her. I accept. The text message from Bernadette took on significant meaning. She'd accepted an invitation to come along on this road trip. He'd extended no such invitation. Holden raised his brows in Devon's direction. His son sank in his seat, looking guilty. If you don't roll with the punches will roll you, Holden murmured, feeling his chest tighten and his lung capacity diminish. That's what my grandpa Harlan used to say. Are we stuck? Bernadette joined them at the front of the motor home. You really should be more careful. These things don't handle at all like a car. Holden faced forward and exhaled slowly, hanging on to his temper. One driver at a time. That, too, was one of his grandfather's sayings. This trip was giving him a renewed appreciation for the old man who'd disowned him. Holden pressed down on the accelerator. Slowly at first, and then because the motor home wasn't moving, he gave it more gas. They didn't move. We're stuck. Bernadette placed her hands on the backs of both front seats and leaned down to peer out the windshield. We're not stuck. Holden breathed in deeply. He was sure he was only imagining the flowery smell of her hair. From the moment they'd met, he'd imagined many things about Bernadette, places he'd like to take her, conversations he'd like to have, anticipating how she'd kiss him in the moonlight beneath the whispering pines. He set his jaw and tried to clear his head of the scents of flowers and peppermint. Try reverse, Bernadette suggested. Yeah, Dad. Try reverse, Devon seconded. Not trusting himself to look at Bernadette, Holden frowned at his son instead. I was just about to do that. He shifted gears and gave the rig gas. Remember, one driver at a time. The motor home didn't budge. We're stuck. Bernadette straightened and patted Holden's shoulder. I'll call for a tow. That's the driver's job. Holden shut off the engine, unbuckled his seatbelt and stood, forcing Bernadette to step back or be taken into his arms. Not that I want her in my arms. At least, not with Dev watching. Holden scowled. Not that I want her in my arms, period. He'd stopped communicating with Bernadette about 4 or 5 weeks ago for several reasons, not the least of which was that he lived in New York City and she lived and practiced medicine in Idaho. It wasn't practical to want her in his arms. And when it came to relationships, Holden was nothing if not practical. Some would say that relationships were the only place he was practical. I'll call for a tow truck, Holden said firmly, reaching for his cell phone. I've got no signal. Bernadette stared at her phone. Me either. Dev stared at his. After glancing at his phone, Holden had to agree. Might I suggest, Bernadette began. No, Holden held up a hand as he held tight to his temper, suddenly recalling that when they were together, it was like two captains trying to helm the same ship. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to walk to the silver mine and ask to use their phone. And if a tow truck can't get here right away, we're going to take the silver mine tour, and we're going to make some really good memories. And then it's on to Yellowstone. He spoke like a boss, like his word was law. Bernadette and Devon exchanged glances, smiles growing on their faces. This is Dad's last chance to create warm fuzzies with me before I become a college man, Devon said with teenage sarcasm. Holden's chest constricted, not from elephants but from heartache. He could recall using the same tone with his father 20 years ago and the derisive feeling that went behind it, my father knows nothing. Is that what Dev thinks of me? Positive experiences are good for team bonding. Bernadette's gaze appraised Holden as her hand drifted to her abdomen. Your father and I need to be a team. Not a couple, a team. That shouldn't annoy Holden. It did. So much for having fun on the tour, Holden grumbled, leading them out the door, out of the wet, muddy ditch and onto the gravel road leading to the mine. Or at least, he thought he was leading them. When he turned around, he stood alone on the road. Let's move, people. Devon came out with a backpack slung over his shoulders. At Holden's questioning glance, he shrugged. What if we miss a tour window and have to wait for a tow truck? I can read. Or we could take in the view of the valley and talk. Holden swallowed back the thought and forced enthusiasm into his reply. Great idea. Carrying a water bottle in one hand, Bernadette closed the motor home's door with a contortion of limbs that sent her sliding 6 feet or so down the muddy ditch with her arms outstretched as if she needed balance while snowboarding. Holden rushed forward as she came to a stop in a puddle and splashed about for firmer footing. Are you okay? Holden asked from above her. Yes, but shoot. Arms still spread, Bernadette stared at her feet. My shoes and socks are wet. Holden moved to help her, extending a hand down. We can wait while you change your shoes. These are the only shoes I brought. She reached for him. He clasped her smaller hand in his. And his breath hitched for reasons that had nothing to do with his health. He'd forgotten how just touching Bernadette jolted him. She felt it, too. Her cheeks pinkened. Holden hauled Bernadette up and only barely resisted bringing her into his arms. Instead, he dropped her hand as if scalded and did an abrupt about-face. Come on, people. He marched onward. Squish squish. Squish squish. Bernadette fell into step with Devon without so much as a complaint about wet shoes or ditched motorhomes. Holden liked that she wasn't high maintenance. Didn't change the fact that their lives were thousands of miles apart, physically and emotionally. He was a city boy. Her roots were in Idaho. He was staring over the ledge of bankruptcy. She was financially secure. He wasn't looking for a long-term relationship. And she? What did Bernadette want? Other than the joy practicing medicine brought her, he couldn't remember. They didn't have long to walk. The Standing Bear Silver Mine Tour was based in a 2-story clapboard building with a large front porch. A sign outside proclaimed mine tours and horseback rides, handmade items, cold drinks and the best burgers in Standing Bear, an easy claim since it was probably the only restaurant in what was otherwise a ghost town. A small playground was situated on the opposite side of the parking lot. 2 blonde toddlers were being pushed on the swings by a young couple. The parents looked as tired as the paint peeling on the building's siding. As tired as Holden had been the past month. As tired as Bernadette would be raising their baby by herself. The elephants bounced on his chest. A motorcycle roared past and down the hill, its slight rider covered in black leathers and helmet. Devon stared after it with a familiar, inquisitive look on his face. Holden made a mental note to take his son motorcycle riding as he opened the door for Bernadette. She paused to wipe the mud from her sneakers on the welcome mat. Devon chose to sit out on the porch, digging in his backpack for a textbook. That kid needed more real-life experience, or those older college kids were going to eat him alive. The building housed a small store jam-packed with Western-themed merchandise to appeal to tourists, cowboy hats, keychains, t-shirts, toys. A display of action figures swarmed a pair of red women's boots. A narrow hallway led to the small diner on the other side of the building, where presumably the best burgers could be had. An elderly woman sporting a brown Standing Bear Silver Mine t-shirt sat on a stool behind the counter. She wore a tan hat that looked like she'd borrowed it from a Canadian Mountie and bent up the front brim. A handwritten name tag proclaimed her to be Myrna, and the appraising look in her eyes said she was in charge. Are you here for the tour and horseback ride? Yes. May I use your phone first? Holden explained about the motor home. Myrna considered him for a moment, scratching beneath the fluff of wispy white hair at her neck. If you buy your tour tickets, you may use my phone. You'll need to sign a waiver to ride. I'm an experienced rider. Holden scribbled his information on a form. I hope you offer more than plodding old nags. I'm sure we'll have a good time regardless. Bernadette touched the toe of the red cowboy boots before perusing a display of Standing Bear Silver Mine onesies and knit caps for babies. Here's the number of a tow truck driver. Myrna noticed Bernadette's interest. Those baby items are on special, buy 2, get 1 free. She placed a landline telephone on the counter for Holden. When are you due, sunshine? And don't look surprised. I can spot a pregnant woman a mile away. Holden gave Bernadette a quick once-over. She didn't look pregnant to him. He requested 3 tickets and handed over his credit card, waiting to hear Bernadette's due date, too. Christmas was all Bernadette had time to say before Myrna was off again. You glow, honey. Myrna ran Holden's credit card. And just look at the two of you, so obviously in love. Holden's shoulders stiffened. Bernadette made a sound like she was choking back a laugh. For all Myrna's acuity at spotting pregnant women, her radar was wonky when it came to reading the bond between Holden and Bernadette. I don't want to pry. But she was going to. Holden could feel it in his bones. But the gap between your first and second child is so big. Fertility problems. Bernadette lay 2 onesies and a knit cap on the counter. Holden thought a new baby would bring the spark back to our relationship. She gave him a sideways glance, as if daring him to deny it. Pre-meltdown, Holden would have parried with something like "Don't let Bernadette kid you." She was pining for another baby. But should he tease her, given their situation? His muddled brain was indecisive, and because the silence stretched, the time for playful banter passed. Shaking his head, he placed a call to the towing service while Myrna cackled. Out on the porch, Devon had a book in his hand but was staring toward where the motorcycle had disappeared. Inside, Bernadette had moved on to look at coffee mugs. She set one down on the counter and studied Myrna's face, opening her mouth as if to say something, and then she closed it again, drifting past some bubble-making toys toward a display of postcards. But she kept slanting concerned looks at Myrna. Holden had seen those looks of Bernadette's before. Once when they'd been dining together and she'd pointed out a spot on the back of a waiter's hand that might have been cancerous. Another time, she'd encouraged a pale woman at a museum exhibit to sit and eat an energy bar. She took her medical oath seriously. But all Holden saw when he looked at Myrna was a thin old woman. After a brief conversation with the tow service, Holden hung up the phone. They'll be here in 2 hours. Maybe 3. Plenty of time for the tour and horseback ride, Myrna said happily. And if you linger, we have a campground here. I'll save you a spot down by the river. We have fire pits and hookups. We're not going to linger, Holden assured her. We're headed to Yellowstone to look at the stars. After we make some memories here first, Bernadette said in a teasing voice. Those arched brows. That hint of a smile. His pounding heart had nothing to do with elephants or anxiety. It was as if they'd never stopped dating, as if she'd welcome him leaning forward and pressing a kiss to her lips. I accept. As if he'd tossed down a gauntlet, she'd picked it up and waved it like a flag in his face. Game on. He very nearly smiled right back at her. That is, until he remembered his life was a mess no woman should want to wade into. You should linger, Myrna said matter-of-factly. It's a quiet campground. The fishing is good. And if you enjoy watching the night sky, we have a small bat population. At sunset, you can see them fly out of their bat houses along the river. Like that's not creepy, Holden murmured. It's not. Bernadette elbowed him. They keep the mosquito population down. And then she sighed and turned to Myrna. Forgive me, but, are you under a doctor's care? Why would you ask something personal like that? The old woman's voice took on a chill, which seemed ironic given her prying nature. Bernadette captured Myrna's thin hand. I'm a doctor, Anne. You think I'm dying? Myrna recoiled, yanking her hand free. No, and then Bernadette added in a stronger voice, no. But, have your energy levels fluctuated recently? Yes, I'm old, you know. Plus, I just took my teenage granddaughter Francesca in. Myrna fidgeted, looking everywhere but at Bernadette. And now, according to you, I look like death. That's not what I said. Bernadette adjusted the set of her thick glasses. A healthy woman like you should be able to run circles around Holden. What? Holden straightened. Hey. Last year I ran a marathon. And last week you spent a night in the hospital. Bernadette's hand touched his shoulder consolingly, bringing back all the nervous feelings of mortality he'd succumbed to on the way to the emergency room. It was a false alarm. Holden couldn't believe he was saying that. It implied acceptance of her diagnosis, that the elephants plaguing his chest were just a byproduct of too much stress log-jammed in his head. When does the tour start? Myrna harumphed and set the phone back on her side of the counter, picking up the receiver to dial. As soon as I'm done making an appointment with my doctor. Pay for this while we wait, Holden. Bernadette left the items she'd collected around the store on the counter and went outside to sit next to Devon, sitting close as if she had something personal to discuss. Regarding her invitation on this trip? He thought so. Everything about Bernadette was straightforward and predictable. Except her surprise pregnancy. Meanwhile, back in Second Chance.
Things were going well for Shane Monroe. In a few months, he was getting married to the love of his life and adopting her 3 awesome little cowboys. Earlier this month, he'd opened up a charitable camp for kids at a nearby lake. Last weekend, he'd successfully pulled off an Old West festival, raising awareness of the town and bringing in much-needed revenue to businesses. And now, most of his cousins and both of his siblings supported the idea of retaining ownership of Second Chance. Grandpa Harlan would be pleased. He sat at the counter of the busy Bent Nickel diner with his 3 soon-to-be sons, not even upset that some tourists had taken his regular table. Stop grinning. His brother Cam placed an iced tea in front of him. Grandpa Harlan used to say when you smiled like that, you were plotting to take over the world. Are you a bad guy, Papa Shane? Little Adam asked, tipping up the brim of his cowboy hat. No, son. I'm allowed to smile because I'm happy. It was all smooth sailing from here until the year's end when the Monroes would take a final vote about Second Chance's future. The bell above the Bent Nickel's front door rang. Most of the locals in the diner turned to see who'd come in, including Shane. A cowboy stood in the doorway, holding the hand of a miniature version of himself and balancing a little girl with dark curls on his hip. There was something familiar about the man, but Shane couldn't put his finger on it. I'm looking for the Monroes, the cowboy said, taking a few more steps inside and allowing the door to close behind him. Which ones? Shane asked, no longer smiling. The cowboy's stare was piercing as Shane's. You for starters.
Chapter 3. Bernadette's wet feet felt as wrinkled as her slim hopes for answers from and about Holden. He was brusque and standoffish, treating her like the interloper she so clearly was in his life. When she tried to joke with him in the tour office, he'd stared at her as if she'd walked into his hospital room when his back was turned and his hospital gown wasn't fastened. In other words, he'd been horrified. Their banter, if one could call it that, had been awkward. She took all the blame for that. She'd been trying to show him they could still be friends. Epic fail, that. Maybe because she was still in love with him. The distinct rumble of his voice in the tour office cut through the sound of birdsong and the toddlers laughing on the swings nearby. Get a grip, Dr. Carlisle, or this will escalate from awkward to disastrous. She would not waste any more time pining after Holden. Beside her on the steps, Devon cleared his throat. And speaking of awkward, the text messages with stilted apologies the past few days. The impersonal queries about her health. The oddly worded trip invitation. It had all seemed immature. And it had been. Pre-med textbooks, Bernadette said in a casual tone of voice, watching the toddlers go down the slide on the other side of the parking lot. You want to be a doctor? Yes. Medical research. Devon clutched that book so tight she thought he was afraid someone would pry it out of his hands. You invited me to come along, didn't you, Devon? Bernadette angled to face the teen. You asked me to come. Without your father's permission. Shoulders hunched, Devon didn't look up from his textbook. Are you mad? No, she should be, but she wasn't the grudge-holding type. And besides, her pregnancy was rocking more than her and Holden's worlds. It affected Devon, too. Poor kid. You've put me in a tight spot with your father. This is supposed to be a trip just for the two of you. Why would I care if you're here? Devon muttered just as Holden opened the door behind him on silent hinges. I was forced into coming. Stone-faced, Holden handed Bernadette her bagged purchases. He walked to the corner of the porch, as far away from them as he could get, where he immediately checked his phone. Not that there was any signal here either. She'd checked her phone earlier. Devin slouched lower over his book. "We're both in the doghouse with your dad now," Bernadette said, getting to her feet. She extended her hand. "What was it your father said about rolling with things?" The teen sighed and accepted her help to stand. "If you don't roll with the punches will roll you." He stowed his book in his backpack. They went down the steps, waiting for the tour to begin. Taking their cue, the young couple threw away their trash and then carried their children from the playground to join Bernadette and Devin. Holden still had his back turned to them. An image of Bernadette's father came to mind, one with the same disconsolate set to his shoulders and a faraway set to his profile. After her dad's terminal cancer diagnosis when she was a teen, he'd spent a lot of time on the back porch, alone with his thoughts, wrestling with decisions he'd made and paths not taken. At least, that's what he told Bernadette when she'd asked him about it. Regrets. They consumed him as surely as cancer consumed his once healthy cells. Holden wasn't terminal. But he was dealing with a teen trying to assert his independence and the fallout from both his own health scare and a hard stop to a romance. Bernadette was willing to bet he had regrets and that he was wrestling with them now. Her hand drifted over her abdomen. She didn't want her baby to be the subject of anyone's regret. Not hers or Holden's. A breeze rustled through the pines, lifting Bernadette's hair across her face. The morning's rain clouds clung to the Sawtooth Mountains, blocking views of the high, stony peaks. A second storm was due to roll in tonight, but for now, the sky above them was clear and bright, at odds with the tension between Bernadette and the two Monroes. She wanted to vanquish that tension. It was why she'd agreed to come on this trip in the first place. Holden's right. Bernadette's words brought Holden's guarded gaze to her. How she missed the warmth in his gray eyes. "We should enjoy this tour, regardless of our differences." Devin groaned. "Not you, too." "Yep, me, too." Bernadette willed Holden not to break eye contact. "I have high hopes for this tour." "Why?" Like a veteran straight man, Devin played right into her hands. "Because I bought a lot of Standing Bear silver mine merchandise." She grinned at Holden. "What am I going to do with it if the tour sucks?" "Ba-dum-bum." Her jest earned her a small smile from Holden and another groan from his son. "Okay, folks." Myrna came out the tour door, cowboy boots ringing with each step. She locked the door, slipped into a worn brown checked shirt and then tied a brown bandana around her neck, looking like a miner from olden times who had yet to strike it rich. "The tour you've all been waiting for is starting. The horseback ride some of you are taking with Francesca departs after we've visited the mine. Everyone follow me." She led them past a signpost that indicated they were headed toward the mine and stables, which were around the corner and down a winding dirt street with old buildings appropriate to the Old West era lining either side. Holden brought up the rear. Myrna stopped in what looked to be the heart of a ghost town, holding out her arms like a master of ceremonies. "This is Standing Bear, a town founded by the Standing Bear Mining Corporation to house and care for their workers. The buildings you see here were built from 1850 to 1895. "When did the mine close?" Holden asked, glancing around with the same curiosity he'd shown when he'd taken Bernadette to an art museum. "In 1955, Myrna said, looking pleased to have an interested audience. "It was never a large producer. The mine has always held more dreams than silver." "What industry supported the town after the main mining rush?" Holden continued to look enthralled with the ramshackle buildings. "Has your dad always been interested in history?" Bernadette whispered to Devin while Myrna answered. "Sadly, yes." Devin hooked his thumbs behind his backpack straps. "I can't tell you how many museums and parks he's dragged me to, all in the name of making memories, only to have the visit drag on because of his curiosity." "You'll cherish trips like this someday," Bernadette told Devin, still in that whisper. "I know when I remember my dad, I do." Devin gave her a sharp look. "I thought you said Dad was fine." "He is." Bernadette used the gentle but firm tone of voice and expression she reserved for hard conversations with patients. But if he doesn't make some serious changes, he might not always be. Prolonged periods of anxiety were detrimental to overall health. Devon's mouth formed a small O. Unfortunately, Myrna slowed her spiel, pointing toward a mine entrance visible in the side of the mountain at the opposite part of town. No large deposits were found after the first big vein. What a waste of resources, Holden said with an unusual dose of pessimism. Men and women could have made an easier life in a bigger city. It takes a certain kind of individual to establish a life in the frontier. Myrna frowned. Mining towns like Standing Bear made the desolate miles between major cities shorter and therefore safer to traverse. For all Myrna's subtle signs of illness, she was passionate about her topic and led Bernadette, the two Monroes and the young family with brisk steps toward the mine itself. Company mining towns offered supplies and provided what were once considered luxury services, like dentistry and doctoring. She stopped and waved a hand toward a pair of small shacks that seemed no bigger than an average bedroom. Some of the original equipment for such services are still inside. Let me see, Mama. Let me see. The little girl reached her arms toward the buildings, revealing a small birthmark on the back of her hand. The young family went up the steps of the dentistry office first and peered in the windows. Devon looked more interested in the doctor's office. Bernadette and Holden followed their tour guide, as if they were the happily married couple Myrna intuited them to be. Those pliers on the wall are what they use to pull teeth. Myrna bobbed her head toward Bernadette. It's hard to imagine them fitting in anyone's mouth. They're so large. I bet lots of miners ran off screaming at the sight of them. Medical instruments also strike fear into the hearts of my patients. No woman liked to see birthing forceps or vaginal speculums. Bernadette squinted through the medical office's windows. There was a small desk, a table and shelves lined with old bottles. Not exactly a surgery center. Or even an urgent care clinic. Devon scoffed. One of those bottles is labeled Dr. Smith's Cure-All. You could read that? Holden leaned over Bernadette's shoulder to peer in. Where? While Devon pointed out the bottle, Bernadette suppressed the urge to settle back against Holden's firm chest. If she did, he wouldn't wrap his strong arms around her. He wouldn't point out something in the office with a soft whisper in her ear. Not that I want him to. She inched clear of him and went down the steps. Closing her eyes, Myrna turned her face toward the sun. I suppose I need to count my blessings. Bernadette rubbed Myrna's shoulder. I didn't mean to scare you. But you did. The older woman sighed. I'm sure after I see my doctor in a few days that I'll be grateful you said something. It's just, until then, I'll be thinking the worst. What if scenarios are bad? And could keep anyone up at night. Try to frame my recommendation to see your doctor as if I was a mechanic notifying you that your oil change light came on. Myrna turned her faded blue gaze toward Bernadette. There was an elegant dignity to the tilt of her chin, a strength that was humbling. As if her life hadn't always been easy, but she refused to give in to adversity. I need an oil change? Bernadette nodded, feeling Holden's eyes upon her and a question unspoken. Do I need an oil change? In Holden's case, the answer was more complicated. Anxiety often struck go-getters who'd taken on too much for too long on too many levels, personally and professionally. And the path toward a more balanced life meant changes, sometimes with the aid of medication, sometimes with therapy, sometimes with a paring down of life responsibilities, often a combination of all three. She presented all options to Holden in the hospital. He'd refused to discuss next steps with her. Did that mean he was going to ignore her advice? Or that he needed more time to process it all? Holden smiled softly, as if sensing Bernadette's thoughts were too serious for a historical tour in the mountains. I think I need Dr. Smith's Cure-All. I bet it claims to treat all sorts of things. Devon grinned. Warts, indigestion, baldness. Holden's hand drifted to his crown. I'm not going bald. That made everyone laugh. Unimpressed by the dentist's office, the two toddlers wove around and between their parents' legs, smiling at each other as if sharing some joke. Bernadette's hand went to her abdomen, and her heart ached. Her child wouldn't have a sibling to play with on rainy days or long car trips, no younger brother or sister to share their innermost secrets with. Bernadette's gaze drifted toward Devin and Holden. Unlike the young family, the pair of Monroes stood apart. There was no ease of proximity, no inside jokes or ruffling of hair, all things she remembered from her childhood as the oldest of 4 children. But Holden was as attentive of his son as these young parents. During the short walk from the motor home to the tour office, he checked on Devin with half glances over his shoulder. And once they'd arrived, he'd kept an eye on his son through the store windows, an unguarded longing in his eyes. "He used to keep an eye on me. The mine awaits." Myrna gestured for the group to follow her. "Is there gold?" The little girl hopped on one foot. "There used to be silver, sunshine." Myrna's tone was as sentimental as her gaze, drifting over the old buildings as if she saw them in a different time. "There used to be a lot of things around here." "Did you grow up in Standing Bear, Myrna?" Bernadette asked, wondering about the source of Myrna's sadness. "I did. And that was the end of that." Myrna marched on toward a tunnel in the mountain. Farther downhill, a young woman with a shaggy fringe of purple hair was saddling a horse by a small barn. Devin lingered at the dentist's office while Holden fell into step with Bernadette. "You're going to raise the baby in second chance?" Holden's tone was so direct it sounded as if he was verifying prescription instructions. "Yes. Assuming my practice in Ketchum cells. I need to help Cal through med school and..." "Cal is your youngest brother?" Holden cut her off. "Yes. I promised him I'd shoulder some of the financial burden of medical school the way my father did for me before he died." "I remember you mentioning Calvin." Holden's gaze turned distant. "You said that as the youngest he took your father's passing harder than the rest of you." "Yes." Funny how Holden remembered details she dropped about her life, but she knew so little about his. Not for lack of listening. It struck her then that Holden was direct in what he wanted to share and what he wanted to know. But there was a difference between directness and honesty. He hadn't told her about Devin. He hadn't responded when she'd blown up his phone over the last few weeks, asking to speak. Unbidden, anger raised its head. The fact that she was facing this pregnancy alone had her backed into a corner. "I'll tell you the truth, Holden. It broke my heart to put my practice up for sale. I could have helped Cal through med school as an OB/GYN. But I can't raise a child alone and dart out at all hours of the night to deliver babies." Holden didn't say a word. She glanced up at him, waiting for his reply. Holden was a handsome, intelligent, confident man. But he'd never truly let her get past that outward exterior. She knew that now. She'd fallen for a witty, successful Wall Street financier. Whatever mounting pressure had culminated in an anxiety attack a few days ago, it wasn't only manifesting itself in his other symptoms, the tight chest and shortness of breath. Since they'd begun dating in February, the gray at his temples seemed more prominent. Not that his touch of gray detracted from his physical appeal in any way. But his continued silence did. Logically, medically, she knew a patient with Holden's symptoms would be suffering from fragmented, racing thoughts that made his replies slower. Her presence was probably adding to his stress, not alleviating it. Her soggy sneakers found root in the compact dirt, and her voice found strength. "When the tour and ride are over, I'll call Shane. He'll find someone to give me a lift back to second chance." "Maybe that's for the best," Holden said, compassion in those gray eyes. "I rarely see my son, and I'd like this time with him to be special. Especially if..." "Your episode was only a warning, Holden. Not a death knell." She reached out and touched his well-muscled bicep. "A few changes and you'll live a long and happy life. Without me or the baby." Her heart ached with sadness, but increasingly, she felt Holden wouldn't be a fixture in her future. his chin thrust out. I heard what you said to Myrna about her oil light coming on. My situation is much more serious. Perhaps, Bernadette allowed, studying those strong cheekbones and worry-tinged eyes, trying to box up her attraction to him and store it in a seldom-to-be-visited corner of her brain. Trying, but failing. She sighed. Perhaps if we build on that oil change metaphor, it was your check engine light that came on. That's serious. So was his attitude. Grimly serious. Don't be so pessimistic. Bernadette wanted to wrap her arms around him and tell him everything was going to be all right, but she knew he'd reject her overture. It's not fatal if treated by a good mechanic. He was in a glass-half-empty frame of mind. He'd never let her be the mechanic to fine-tune his engine. But she suddenly regretted her decision to leave the Monroe road trip. Because she wanted to try.
Meanwhile, back in Second Chance. I'm Tanner Monroe Paxton. The cowboy lifted his little boy onto a stool near Shane and then shifted the little dark-haired girl from one hip to the other. And I own a share of this town. Cold settled over Shane, drowning out the warmth and happiness he'd felt before. His three little cowpokes craned their necks for a better look at the stranger. Simultaneously, a quiet blanketed the bent nickel diner. The kind of quiet that said everyone was straining their ears to hear how Shane would react to the stranger and his claim. Part owner? No kidding. Kim stole Shane's thunder and the spotlight. Grandpa Harlan had a fifth wife we didn't know about? Nope. Tanner hitched the little girl higher on his hip. She stuck her thumb in her mouth and her head on his shoulder. My grandfather was Hobart Monroe, Harlan's twin brother. Ruth, Shane murmured, finding his voice. Hobart was married to Ruth when he died. My grandmother. Tanner nodded. She moved to Texas, pregnant, and married my grandpa to make a family for my daddy. Someone from Second Chance called Grandma Ruth last week with an interesting story about lost stagecoach gold found by the Monroes. That's when Ruth told me about Hobart and gave me this. He produced a small gold coin from his pocket and laid it on the diner counter. The cold in Shane's veins prickled his skin. He had an entire antique lockbox filled with similar coins. Tanner gently removed the little girl's thumb from her mouth. Hobart was with your granddaddy when they found the gold the first time. The way I figure it, I'm owed a share of this town, and I'm not leaving until we make it legal. If you want to discuss this further, we'll require proof that you are who you say you are, Shane said evenly, although the family resemblance was uncanny. Tanner nodded, but he didn't reach into his pocket for anything else. Shane exchanged a glance with his brother Cam and had one unexpected thought. If this guy is legit, we'll need legal protection. A good lawyer and a good negotiator. There was a good lawyer in town, Mitch Kincaid, who'd stepped back from the legal world to run the lodgepole in. As for a negotiator, Shane didn't kid himself. When it came to deal-making and money, there was only one man for the job, Holden.